Okay, welcome back, guys. We're going to continue with respiratory system and just continue moving forward with our content. So let's see where we left off. We were talking about the larynx. We mentioned how the larynx is also known as the voice box. There's a couple structures in the larynx that we needed to discuss. We talked about the thyroid, which is not necessarily part of the larynx. It's just found in that area. It's an endocrine organ, which we're going to learn in the endocrine system. We mentioned the epiglottis, very, very important structure. I call it the gatekeeper, opens and closes depending on what is traveling down the throat. And now we get to continue moving forward with the last major structure of the larynx, which is going to be the vocal cords. The vocal cords, or also known as the vocal folds. The reason we call it the vocal folds is because it's not like the strings of a guitar. You're not strumming it to create sound. It's literally folds of tissue that open and close, sort of like this, to create sound when it vibrates against air that has been expulsed from the body. So that's what we see here, vibrating with expelled air to create sound and inevitably create speech. You also have this structure called the glottis. It is just the opening for the vocal cords. And remember, we just said epiglottis before. That means it's above the glottis. That's all. But as far as this is concerned with speech, it's a really intricate process. And honestly, it really intrigues me how this whole thing works. So what we observe happening is the first thing that has to happen is you breathe out. As you breathe out, it vibrates the vocal cords, and that's going to create sound. Okay, sounds good. That sound is then going to travel upward and enter your skull. And when it enters the skull, the sound is going to bounce off of the cavities known as the sinuses. That's what creates resonance, what we talked about in our last video. As it does that, it continues bouncing, and then inevitably, it's going to reach the outside, which is your mouth, and the sound it emits, right? But is that technically speech? Not yet. We require the brain for this, and this is stuff that we're going to learn more when we do our nervous system content. But the brain is able to help manipulate the tongue and the mouth and move the lips in such a way and move the tongue in such a way that allows for you to manipulate the sounds that you're making and make it into words, make it into sounds and syllables. So pretty interesting, pretty fascinating process. Okay, trachea. The trachea is going to be also known as the windpipe. It connects the larynx with the bronchi. We do need to know this right here. It's lined with what's called ciliated mucosa. I will just make sure we're comfortable with that material. The ciliated mucosa are basically tiny, tiny microscopic hairs that have mucus on them. Why do we have tiny, tiny hairs with mucus on them in our trachea? They beat continuously in the opposite direction of incoming air. So if you're breathing in, so air is traveling downward, then the mucosa, the ciliated mucosa, is actually going in the opposite direction. So that counter force is going to make it so that it can generate it's going to make it so that you can remove any sort of unnecessary dust and debris, which is what we see there. Expel mucus loaded with dust and debris away from lungs. Walls are reinforced with C-shaped hyaline cartilage. So these cartilage rings just help to reinforce the trachea so that if you turn your head left to right, up or down, you can still breathe effectively. It's the same cartilage that's found in the larynx, the same cartilage that's found in the bronchi, which we're about to talk about. So it's all the same. Okay, next. Primary bronchi. These are formed by the division of the trachea. So the trachea splits and then eventually moves left and right, and that's going to be called the bronchi at this point. Where it enters the lung, we call that the hilus. I don't get too crazy with that, so don't worry. The right bronchus is going to be wider, shorter, and straighter than the left. That is pretty important, and we'll talk about that in just a second. The bronchi will subdivide into smaller and smaller branches. Finally, we're in the lungs. As far as the lungs are concerned, they occupy most of the thoracic cavity. They're rather large, after all. The apex of the lungs is near the clavicle, so near the collarbone. The base of the lungs is going to be near your diaphragm. Specifically rests on top of the diaphragm. You can find your diaphragm pretty easily if you find your belly button and then go up about half an inch or so. This we do need to be aware of. Each lung is divided into lobes by fissures. The left lung is going to have 2 lobes, whereas the right lung is going to have 3. Why do we see this difference? Well, this is the same thing that we saw on the bronchi information, as far as the right bronchus being wider and shorter and smaller. The reason the left lung is going to be a little bit smaller than the right is because the heart. So the heart actually sits tilted towards the left. It's not perfectly smack dab in the middle of our chest. It sits a little bit towards your left-hand side. And because of that, the left lung is going to be a little bit smaller. So I would make sure we're comfortable with that. I would make sure we know that material just to be safe. All right. What else do we see here? This is just a great view, a great angle of a top-down perspective of the lungs and the heart. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk more about in cardiovascular system, so we don't have to necessarily worry about it right now. Coverings of the lungs, I'm just going to verbally talk about this. Many major organs have a covering. So knowing that they have this covering, that's all you really need to know. The coverings are there to help reduce, more than often, they're there to help reduce friction so that if anything rubs up against it, it's not going to generate unnecessary levels of heat. The respiratory tree divisions, this is just telling us that as soon as the bronchi begin, which is where the lungs, where the trachea splits, it becomes smaller and smaller. Literally, it's just a tree that has many branches that become smaller and smaller and smaller. So the first division is going to be primary bronchi, then secondary bronchi, then tertiary bronchi, finally bronchioli and terminal bronchioli, which is going to be the end. Bronchioli, by the way, this suffix right here, OLI. There's another suffix that you'll see sometimes. It's the same thing, OLE. Both of those stand for small. So bronchioli or bronchiole is just a super small bronchus. That's all. The terminal bronchioli is going to be the last one. Terminal meaning ending or the end, right? Okay. Let's continue onward. This is just some stuff I'm going to move through a little bit quicker, but we see here the bronchioles, the smallest branches of the bronchi. I love this picture, by the way. What I really do like a lot is this right here. It shows a really good image indicating like the bronchus entering the lungs, and then eventually the smaller and smaller secondary and tertiary and bronchioles that are formed. Next, all but the smallest branches have reinforcing cartilage. That cartilage is there to support everything. The terminal bronchi, which is what we see here, the terminal bronchiole, is where it all ends, and that's where we're going to have the alveoli found. The alveoli, there are some other structures. I don't even really get too much into it. So for instance, just to talk about it, alveolar duct is what you see here. It's the actual tube that holds the alveoli. Alveolar sac is a bunch of these alveoli together. And then alveolus is one of them by themselves. This is just arguing semantics. We don't need to worry too much about this. This is what we call the respiratory zone. So these are the structures that allow for gas exchange. Honestly, I'm perfectly fine with just knowing that the alveoli specifically is where this stuff happens. Once again, this is the same stuff that we just saw. This we should understand a little bit more. The air-blood barrier. So what separates air and blood are these two, well, technically three, but these two regions. You have this thin squamous epithelial layer, which is found in the alveoli. And then you have these capillaries, which the capillaries carry blood. Capillaries are a type of vessel, just like arteries and veins. We're going to learn more about that in cardiovascular system, but they're very, very thin vessels that allow for things to move back and forth rapidly. Okay, now this is important. This is still that air-blood barrier conversation that we were just having. On here on the left-hand side, we can see these massive purple pore structures. This is what an alveoli would look like under a microscope. Obviously, this is a rendition of that, right? It's not supposed to be all colorful. But these big pores, that would be the alveoli themselves. These things in green would be the surfactant cells, which we're going to talk about in our next video. These things in white would be the macrophages, which we'll talk about in our cardiovascular content. And then finally, these red things here, those are red blood cells. Let's zoom in a little bit to see what's going on. So here we get to see how gases move. Now, if you remember biology, which if you're taking an anatomy class, I would hope you've reviewed your biology. But if you remember biology, the movement of molecules from high to low concentration is diffusion. So what do we mean by movement of molecules? Let's say I had 2 molecules of oxygen, O2, in the alveolus, and I had no molecules, 0 molecules of oxygen in the blood. What diffusion states is that these molecules are going to want to fly over into the red blood cell because there's none there. Literally, you're just moving from high to low concentration. As simple as that. While the oxygen is moving, by the way, your red blood cells are trying to get rid of a toxic product. This toxic product can kill you if it stays in your blood for too long, and that's CO2. Carbon dioxide. Let's say we had 2 molecules of CO2 in the blood, but you had none in your alveolus. Well, the rules of diffusion state that you're going to want to move all of this carbon dioxide out. So we're going to push this carbon dioxide out into the alveolus. That's what we're hoping to do. So this movement of gases back and forth is what we call gas exchange, and it needs diffusion. It requires diffusion. Finally, the last thing I want you to be aware of, you see these structures right here? I don't necessarily need you to know the names of them. I'm not going to get too crazy with naming them. But what is important is knowing that there are 3 layers that separate the alveolus from the capillary, and you can see them right here. Those 3 thin layers makes it so that gases can move rapidly. Why do we care about that? Because when it comes down to diffusion, one of the limiting factors for diffusion is how many layers are there between the start and the end, between where these things need to move. Theoretically speaking, if you had no lungs, you could still breathe. You could still get air into your body through diffusion, because air surrounds us at all times, right? Makes sense. The problem is this. If air was diffusing through your skin and had to reach your blood, it would take so long that you'd be long gone. You'd be dead. It has to pass through skin. It has to pass through fat. It has to pass through muscle. It has to pass through bone. And then eventually you're finally reaching blood, and it wouldn't be good. Your body would not be able to function. So for sure, this is something that could be more problematic if there's too many layers. But that's why we evolved to have lungs. This very, very thin structure, these alveoli that are super sensitive, allows for gases to move into the blood rapidly. And that's the goal. Okay. All right. So thanks for tuning in, guys. I'll see you on the next one. We'll continue progressing forward. Have a great rest of your day.